istopia se in North America, the Middle East, China, Russia, South Korea, and the global economy all at the same time. From a major escalation over the Strait of Hormuz to new pressure on China, a dramatic shift in U.S. South Korea military exercises, new immigration actions, and growing pressure over Russia and Ukraine. The Trump administration is facing one of its most complicated foreign policy moments of 2026. Here is what you need to know. Let's start with the biggest story: Iran, Oman, and the Strait of Hormuz. The situation between the United States and Iran has reached another dangerous point. President Trump has said Iran should surrender, while negotiations aimed at ending the conflict remain stalled. And now, Oman has become a major part of the story. Oman has been working with Iran on arrangements involving the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most strategically important waterways in the world. Trump has warned Oman against getting in the way of U.S. objectives, and he has even threatened military action if Oman blocks American efforts. Iran, meanwhile, has warned that if diplomacy fails, it could move from a defensive position to a fully offensive military posture. That could have enormous consequences. Why? Because the Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important energy routes on Earth. Before, the current conflict disrupted traffic. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas supplies normally passed through this narrow waterway, and shipping through the strait has already slowed dramatically. That means this is not just a military story. It is also an economic story. If the Strait of Hormuz remains heavily restricted, energy prices could rise, transportation costs could increase, and consumers around the world could feel the impact. Oil markets are already watching the situation closely. So the question now is not simply whether Trump and Iran can reach a deal. The bigger question is whether diplomacy can prevent the conflict from becoming an even larger regional and global economic crisis. Now let's move to China. The Trump administration is continuing to pressure Beijing through tariffs and trade policy. But Washington is now focusing on another problem, what it calls tariff evasion through transshipment. The White House says Chinese goods are being rerouted through other countries before entering the United States in order to avoid higher tariffs.
According to a new White House report, more than 40 countries could be involved in some form of this transshipment network. The administration says the practice is costing the United States billions of dollars in lost tariff revenue, and Washington is now looking at using artificial intelligence and other tools to identify suspicious shipments and determine where products actually originated. China has rejected the American accusations. This creates another major challenge for U.S.-China relations. Trump wants American companies to manufacture more products inside the United States. He also wants to reduce America's dependence on Chinese supply chains. But China remains deeply connected to global manufacturing. So every new tariff or trade restriction creates a second question. Can the United States actually replace Chinese production quickly enough without increasing prices for American consumers? That is one of the biggest economic battles of the Trump presidency. And China is not only an economic issue. It is also connected to technology, national security, artificial intelligence, critical minerals, manufacturing, drones, and global supply chains. The Trump administration has also recently moved to impose tariffs on drones and drone components, describing the policy as a national security and supply chain measure. Soteikamic. Competition between Washington and Beijing is becoming increasingly connected to national security. Now let's turn to Russia and Ukraine. The Russia-Ukraine war remains another major challenge for the Trump administration. The United States has been pushing for an end to the war, while Russia and Ukraine continue to disagree over the conditions for a lasting settlement. At the same time, pressure inside Washington is growing. The U.S. Senate has advanced major Russia sanctions legislation that could dramatically increase economic pressure on Moscow. The legislation would target Russian energy revenues and could also affect foreign companies doing business with Russia. One particularly important part of the proposed sanctions package is the potential use of very high tariffs against countries that continue major economic relationships with Russia. That could become especially important for countries such as China and India. And that brings Russia back into the China story. If Washington increases pressure on Russia while simultaneously confronting China over trade, the United States could end up applying economic pressure to two of its biggest geopolitical competitors at the same time. But there is a major question. Will Trump actually use the full power of these sanctions? Or will negotiations with Moscow take priority? That remains uncertain. Now let's move to the Korean Peninsula. This is another major development that could have consequences far beyond Asia. President Trump has ordered the Pentagon to substantially reduce planned joint military exercises with South Korea.
The decision comes as tensions involving North Korea remain a major security concern. Trump has pointed to his relationship with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and has also criticized the cost and nature of the military exercises. South Korea, however, remains a critical U.S. ally in the region, and officials in Seoul have expressed hope that diplomacy with North Korea could eventually resume. The big question is whether reducing military exercises will lower tensions or create new concerns about military readiness. Supporters could argue that fewer exercises could create space for diplomacy. Critics argue that reducing military preparedness could send the wrong signal to North Korea. And there is another geopolitical factor here. China, Beijing, is watching what happens between Washington, Seoul, and Pyongyang very closely. So even a decision involving military exercises on the Korean Peninsula can become part of the larger competition between the United States and China. Now, let's come back home to the United States. Trump's domestic agenda remains just as aggressive. Immigration continues to be one of his administration's biggest priorities. Earlier this month, Trump signed new executive actions targeting birth tourism and seeking to further define who qualifies for American citizenship under his administration's interpretation of the law.
The issue remains highly controversial and is facing legal challenges. The administration is also continuing its broader immigration enforcement agenda, and that means immigration will likely remain one of the biggest political issues in America as the country moves closer to the 2026 midterm elections. But immigration isn't the only domestic issue. Trump is also focusing heavily on prices and the economy. The White House is highlighting what it describes as major progress in lowering prescription drug prices. The The administration says new actions are producing the largest prescription drug, price reduction in decades. But Americans are still watching the bigger economic picture: food prices, energy prices, housing, interest rates, jobs, and the cost of everyday life. And then there are Trump's tariffs. The administration argues that tariffs can protect American industries, strengthen domestic manufacturing, and generate government revenue. Critics argue that tariffs can also increase costs for businesses and consumers and create uncertainty for companies that depend on international supply chains. That debate is not going away. In fact, it may become even more important as Trump continues expanding the use of trade policy as a tool of both economic and national security strategy. And there is another major domestic issue developing right now: the courts. The Trump administration continues to face legal battles over several of its policies. The Supreme Court has already played a major role in disputes involving presidential power, immigration, and citizenship, and new court decisions could determine how much of Trump's agenda can actually be implemented. So when you look at everything happening right now, you can see that Trump's presidency is operating on several fronts at once. Inside America, he is pushing immigration restrictions, economic policies, tariffs, and actions aimed at lowering prices. With China, he is escalating the battle over trade, supply chains, technology, and tariff enforcement.
With Russia, Washington is weighing stronger sanctions while still facing the enormous challenge of ending the war in Ukraine. With South Korea and North Korea, Trump is changing the American military posture while leaving the door open to diplomacy with Kim Jong-un. And in the Middle East, the situation is even more dangerous. Iran, Oman, the Strait of Hormuz, Israel, Gulf, oil prices, global shipping. All of these issues are now connected. And that is what makes today's Trump story so important. This is no longer just about one presidential decision. It is about how the United States uses economic pressure, military power, diplomacy, tariffs, alliances, and negotiations at the same time. The biggest question is what happens next. Will Trump be able to turn pressure on Iran into a negotiated agreement? Can the Strait of Hormuz be reopened without a larger military escalation? Will China respond to American tariff enforcement with new trade restrictions of its own? Will Russia accept stronger pressure and move toward a settlement with Ukraine? Will reducing U.S. South Korea military exercises create a diplomatic opening with North Korea? And inside America, will Trump's economic and immigration policies become political advantages before the midterm elections? Nobody can know the answers yet. But one thing is clear. The decisions being made in Washington right now are not staying in Washington. They are affecting energy markets, global trade, military alliances, international politics, and if the situation around Iran and the Strait of Hormuz gets worse, the economic consequences could reach far beyond the Middle East. So this is a story to watch very closely, because in Trump's second presidency, foreign policy, economics, national security, and domestic politics are becoming more connected every single day. And the next major decision from the White House could change the entire story again. This is your Trump Global Update. Stay with us for the next major development.